winter of 1956 had wrapped New York City in a suffocating grip of ice and gray slush. The wind howling off the East River felt like a straight razor against the cheek. But inside the private back room of a heavily guarded social club in Lower Manhattan, the air was thick, warm, and choked with the heavy blue smoke of imported Cuban cigars. This was a room where the fate of neighborhoods was decided with the nod of a head and the clinking of crystal tumblers. This was a room where arrogance was the primary currency, and the men sitting around the polished mahogany table were the wealthiest merchants in the city. They were the architects of the Italian underworld. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, his eyes hooded, his throat raspy, radiating the quiet, dangerous power of a man who rarely had to raise his voice to order a tragedy. To his left sat Carlo Gambino, a man whose gentle, grandfatherly smile masked the cold, reptilian calculation in his eyes. Across from them were Vito Genovese and Thomas Lucchese, men who built their empires on concrete and extortion, and pacing the floor, chewing on a matchstick with a look of barely contained madness, was Vincent Gigante. They were the masters of the downtown universe, but tonight their collective attention was focused squarely on a piece of geography they did not control. They were talking about the world above 110th Street. They were talking about Harlem. And when you talked about Harlem, you were talking about one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He is becoming a problem that we can no longer ignore, Costello rasped, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. He acts as if he operates a sovereign nation up there. He dictates the numbers, he controls the flow of our goods, and he looks at us not as partners, but as guests in his house. A house we built. Gambino smiled that chilling, empty smile. The man reads too many books. He sits in his apartment, playing chess, thinking he is a king. But a king without an army is just a man waiting for the guillotine. Genovese leaned forward, his heavy hands resting on the table. So we send the army. We send a crew uptown. We kick in the door of his precious Lenox Terrace apartment, and we leave him on the floor. It is simple arithmetic. We have the numbers. He does not. Costello shook his head slowly, waving a dismissive hand through the thick cigar smoke. You do not shoot a man like Bumpy Johnson in his own neighborhood. If you put a bullet in him, you make him a martyr. You turn him into a ghost, a legend that the young cats on the corner will sing about for the next 50 years. You shoot him, and Harlem burns. We cannot collect envelopes from a neighborhood that is on fire. Then what is the play? Lucchese asked, his brow furrowed. We cannot let him continue to dictate terms. The street whispers. They say the Italians are afraid of the black man in the fine suits. It is bad for business. It makes us look weak. We do not kill him, Costello said softly, a cruel glint catching the dim light in his eyes. We break him. We take his dignity. Bumpy's power does not come from his gun. It comes from the respect of his people. They view him as untouchable. They view him as the man who bows to no one. If we show them that he is just another punk, a frightened boy who can be manhandled by our people in front of his own crowd, the myth shatters. When the myth shatters, the respect evaporates. And when the respect evaporates, we simply walk in and take the crown off the floor. The bosses murmured in agreement. It was a strategy born of pure psychological warfare. Who do we send? Gigante asked, stopping his pacing to lean over the table. It has to be someone who does not care about the myth, someone who is a pure animal. Costello didn't hesitate. We send Vito Marcello. The name hung in the room like a drop of poison suspended in a glass of water. Vito Marcello was not a strategist. He was not a thinker. He was a weapon. He was a massive, terrifying enforcer imported from the old country, a man whose hands were the size of cinder blocks and whose eyes held the blank, empty void of a natural-born predator. He was the man the family sent when a message needed to be delivered with bone-crushing finality. "The Cotton Club," Genovese suggested, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Johnson holds court there on Saturday nights. He sits at the VIP table with the politicians and the jazz singers, pretending he is royalty." "Perfect," Costello said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Vito will walk into the Cotton Club this Saturday. He will walk right up to Bumpy's table. He will grab him by the collar of his expensive Italian suit, lift him out of his chair, and slap him across the face in front of the entire room. He will tell him that the Italians run the city, and he will drop him back into his seat like a disobedient child. No bullets, just a total public humiliation, and Bumpy will do nothing, because he knows if he fights back, Vito will snap his neck in front of the bandstand." The plan was set. It was a masterstroke of arrogant brutality. But the men in that smoke-filled room made the oldest mistake in the history of power. They assumed they were invisible. They assumed the people who served them, the people who drove them, the people who cleaned their messes, were deaf, dumb, and blind. Outside the social club, the bitter wind whipped snow across the windshield of an idling yellow taxicab. The heater in the cab was broken, rattling uselessly against the freezing temperatures. The driver sitting behind the wheel wore a thick wool cap and a worn peacoat, blowing into his cupped hands to keep the blood flowing. His name was Marcus. To the businessmen and gangsters of downtown Manhattan, Marcus was just a piece of the city's machinery, an invisible servant who transported them from point A to point B. But Marcus was a man from Harlem. More importantly, he was a man whose daughter had fallen deathly ill the previous winter. When the downtown hospitals refused to admit her without cash up front, it was Bumpy Johnson who had quietly sent a doctor to Marcus's apartment, entirely covering the medical bills and the cost of the medicine. Bumpy had never asked for a favor in return. He had simply patted Marcus on the shoulder and told him to take care of his family. Marcus owed the king of Harlem a debt that money could never repay. He repaid it with his loyalty, and he repaid it with his ears. The heavy wooden door of the social club swung open, and two men stepped out into the biting cold. One was a mid-level capo for the Genovese family, shivering in his overcoat. The other was a mountain of a man who seemed entirely unaffected by the freezing wind, Vito Marcello. He wore a dark suit stretched tight across his massive shoulders, his face a landscape of old scars and unbroken hostility. They climbed into the back of Marcus's cab. The capo knocked roughly on the plexiglass partition. "Uptown, East Harlem, and step on it. It is freezing out here." Marcus didn't say a word. He simply put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, his eyes glued to the slick, icy streets. But as the cab rumbled north, the two men in the back seat began to talk. They spoke in low, confident tones, entirely ignoring the black driver in the front seat, assuming he was either too ignorant to understand or too frightened to care. "Costello is right," the capo said, lighting a cigarette and cracking the window just an inch. "A bullet is too quick for Johnson. This Saturday is going to be a masterpiece. I want to see the look on his face when you grab him, Vito." Vito Marcello grunted, a sound that resembled a boulder scraping against concrete. I am going to lift him so high his polished shoes dangle off the floor. I will grab him by his silk collar, and I will squeeze until he begs. Right in the middle of the Cotton Club, in front of his women, in front of his people, he will look like a frightened little rat. Just remember the instructions, the capo cautioned. Do not kill him, just humiliate him. Break his pride. Once his pride is gone, the neighborhood is ours. Vito cracked his massive knuckles, the sound loud like snapping dry branches in the enclosed space of the cab. I will not kill him. But I will make him wish I did. By the time I drop him, the legend of Bumpy Johnson will be completely dead. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening until his knuckles turned ashen under his dark skin. He focused on the rhythm of the windshield wipers, pushing the heavy snow aside, memorizing every single word that echoed from the back seat. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the devastating impact a public humiliation would have on Bumpy's carefully constructed empire. An hour later, Marcus dropped the men off at a social club in East Harlem. The capo tossed a few crumpled bills through the partition, not even bothering to look at the driver. As soon as the heavy doors of the club closed behind them, Marcus slammed his foot on the accelerator. He did not go home. He did not take another fare. He drove the rattling yellow cab straight into the heart of central Harlem, the tires spinning on the slushy asphalt, desperate to beat the ticking clock of the coming weekend. Marcus found Junie Bard sitting in a dimly lit diner on Lenox Avenue. Junie was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He was Bumpy's most trusted enforcer, a man who possessed a quiet, coiled energy that terrified even the most hardened street hustlers. Junie was eating a slice of cherry pie in absolute silence, his eyes tracking every single movement in the diner with the casual precision of a hawk. Marcus slid into the booth across from him, breathless, his wool cap dusted with snow. I need to see the old man, Junie, right now. It's life or death. Junie didn't blink. He didn't ask questions. He simply took one final, deliberate bite of his pie, dropped a dollar bill on the table, and stood up. When a man like Marcus came looking for Bumpy with panic in his eyes, you didn't ask for a summary. You took him to the king. The Lenox Terrace apartment was a sanctuary of warmth and refined elegance, a stark contrast to the brutal winter storm raging outside the windows. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves holding volumes of philosophy, history, and classic literature. A record player in the corner spun a low, mournful Coltrane melody. Mamie Johnson sat on a plush velvet sofa, her posture immaculate, reading a copy of Vogue. She was a woman of extraordinary grace and fierce intelligence, the anchor that kept Bumpy grounded in a world of constant chaos. Bumpy himself was seated at a heavy oak table near the window, staring intensely at a chessboard. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the muscular forearms of a man who had survived the most violent prisons in America, and a pair of tailored gray trousers. He was playing against himself, moving the black and white pieces with slow, deliberate contemplation. When Junie and Marcus entered, Bumpy did not look up immediately. He moved a white knight, his fingers lingering on the carved wood. A man who runs into a room breathing heavy is a man who is letting his emotions dictate his pace, Marcus, Bumpy said softly, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that commanded instant attention. Catch your breath. Then tell me why you are standing on my imported rug with snow on your boots. Marcus took off his cap, twisting the wool nervously in his hands. He recounted the drive. He detailed the conversation between the capo and Vito Marcello. He laid out the entire plot of the 5 families, the calculated strategy to avoid a shooting, and instead orchestrate a devastating public humiliation at the Cotton Club on Saturday night. "They want to break you, Mr. Johnson," Marcus finished, his voice trembling slightly. "This Vito character, he's a monster. They want him to grab you in front of the whole club and make you look weak." The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The record players seemed to echo loudly in the stillness. Junie Byard shifted his weight, his hand instinctively resting over the bulge of the cold steel tucked into his waistband. "Give me the word, Bumpy," Junie whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, barely contained rage. "I will go downtown tonight. I will find this Vito Marcello, and I will put him in the East River in 3 separate bags. Nobody plans to put their hands on you and lives to see the morning." Mamie slowly closed her magazine and placed it on the glass coffee table. She looked at her husband, her sharp eyes studying his profile. She knew Bumpy better than he knew himself. She saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his breathing. Bumpy slowly picked up a black pawn from the chessboard and turned it over in his hand. "No, Junie," Bumpy said, his voice entirely devoid of panic or anger. It was the voice of a professor analyzing a difficult equation. "If we shoot Vito Marcello, Costello and Gambino win. They want a war. They want an excuse to flood Harlem with their soldiers and tell the police that we are the aggressors. If we kill their attack dog, they will just buy 10 more. So what do we do?" Junie asked, his brow furrowed in frustration. "You can't let him walk into the Cotton Club and put his hands on you. The street respects strength. If they see a white man grab the king of Harlem by the collar and shake him, the young cats on the corner will think the crown is slipping. The Italians will move in the next day." Bumpy placed the pawn back on the board with a decisive, quiet click. "They think I am a proud man, Junie. They think my pride will force me into a brawl that a man of Vito's size will inevitably win, or that my pride will shatter when he disrespects me. They think this is a game of checkers. They think it is about who can punch the hardest." Bumpy stood up, walking slowly over to the window to look out at the snow-covered streets of his kingdom. "We don't react to their moves. We control the board. They are sending Vito Marcello to deliver a message to Harlem. I think it is time we used Vito Marcello to deliver a message back to downtown, a message they will never, ever forget." Bumpy turned to Marcus, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a thick money clip. He peeled off 2 crisp $100 bills and pressed them into the cab driver's cold hands. "You did well, Marcus. You proved that loyalty is worth more than gold. Go home, buy your wife something warm, buy your daughter a new coat, and forget you ever heard that conversation." Marcus nodded respectfully, backing out of the room. When the door clicked shut, Bumpy turned to Junie. The ice-cold calculation in Bumpy's eyes was terrifying. It was the look of a man who had spent long years in solitary confinement, building an iron fortress in his mind. A man who viewed every threat not as a danger, but as an opportunity for absolute dominance. "We have 72 hours until Saturday night," Bumpy said, rolling down his sleeves and reaching for his suit jacket. "Junie, I need you to go to the Cotton Club. Speak to the maitre d'. I want my usual table moved 3 feet closer to the bandstand. I want a candelabra placed exactly in the center of the table, and I want the candles lit at precisely 9 o'clock. Junie looked confused, but nodded. "Done." "What about Vito?" The man is a brute. If he gets his hands on you, it won't just be an insult. He could break your neck." "He will not break my neck, Junie," Bumpy said softly, slipping into his tailored coat, "because I am going to let him grab me, exactly as he plans." Mamie stood up from the sofa, her brow raised in concern, but she didn't argue. She knew that when Bumpy Johnson orchestrated a trap, it was flawless. "Where are you going, Ellsworth?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. "I have to make 2 stops, Bumpy replied, adjusting his fedora in the mirror by the door. "First, I need to see a man about a chemistry lesson. Second, I need to see an old friend about the mechanics of human anatomy. Do not wait up, Mamie. The preparation for this performance requires precision." Bumpy stepped out into the freezing night, leaving the warmth of the apartment behind. He did not take his Cadillac. He walked. He moved through the snowy streets of Harlem like a ghost, his mind working in overdrive, calculating distances, timing, and human psychology. He knew that brute force was a blunt instrument. True power was a scalpel. His first destination was a place most people in Harlem didn't even know existed. Deep in the labyrinthine alleys near the eastern edge of the neighborhood, beneath a dilapidated laundry business, was a basement apothecary run by an elderly, reclusive man known only as Dr. Chen. Chen was a master of ancient remedies, a man who possessed a deep, dangerous knowledge of botany, chemistry, and the fragile nervous system of the human body. He operated completely off the grid, supplying untraceable compounds to people who needed solutions that a traditional pharmacy could never provide. Bumpy walked down the crumbling concrete steps, the air growing thick and humid the deeper he went. He knocked on the heavy iron door, 2 sharp raps, a pause, and one more. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous basement illuminated by the soft, flickering light of dozens of oil lamps. The sensory overload was immediate. The room smelled of sulfur, dried lavender, boiling vinegar, and crushed root. Glass jars lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with strange floating specimens and powders of every conceivable color. In the center of the room, standing over a bubbling glass beaker, was Dr. Chen. He was a frail-looking man with a long, wispy beard, wearing a silk robe that had seen better decades. "Mr. Johnson," Dr. Chen said, his voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves. He did not look surprised. Men like Bumpy Johnson only came to the basement when the stakes were absolute. "It is late. The snow is heavy. What brings the king of Harlem to my humble cellar?" Bumpy walked carefully through the maze of tables and beakers, stopping a few feet from the old man. "I need something specific, doctor. Something very unique." Chen wiped his hands on a rag, his dark, intelligent eyes studying Bumpy's face. "Unique is my specialty. Are you looking for a cure, a comfort, or a consequence?" "A consequence," Bumpy said, his voice ice cold. "I am going to be entertaining a guest this weekend, a very large, very aggressive man. He relies entirely on his physical strength. He relies on his hands to terrorize people. I need a compound, a topical liquid, fast-acting." Chen nodded slowly, intrigued. "What effect do you desire?" "I need something that reacts with extreme heat and broken skin," Bumpy explained, his mind visualizing the layout of the Cotton Club table. "I need a compound that, when introduced to a severe, blistering burn, attacks the nervous system locally. I do not want to kill him. I want to paralyze the muscles in his hand and forearm. I want the nerves to freeze permanently so that the hand curls into a useless claw and never opens again. I want him to spend the rest of his life looking at his dead hand, remembering the moment he decided to touch me." Dr. Chen remained silent for a long time. The only sound in the basement was the rhythmic bubbling of the beaker. The old chemist walked over to a towering wooden cabinet, his fingers trailing over the brass handles. "You ask for something deeply complex, Mr. Johnson. A neurotoxin that destroys motor function without entering the bloodstream to stop the heart. It requires the venom of a specific marine snail, distilled and combined with a highly concentrated alkaloid." "Can you make it?" Bumpy asked, pulling a thick roll of bills from his coat pocket and placing it on the table. "And can you make it small enough to fit inside a ring or a hollowed-out cufflink?" Dr. Chen looked at the money, then at Bumpy. A thin smile touched his lips. "I can make it fit inside a vial no larger than a teardrop. It will be clear, odorless, and completely undetectable until it is applied to an open, seared wound. Once it touches the raw nerve endings, the paralysis will be instantaneous and irreversible. But it will cost you twice what you have placed on my table, and it will take me 24 hours to synthesize it." Bumpy added another stack of bills to the pile without a moment's hesitation. "I will be back tomorrow night. Have it ready, doctor." With the chemical weapon secured, Bumpy needed the physical delivery system. He left the basement and walked 20 blocks through the freezing snow to an old run-down boxing gym on 8th Avenue. The gym was closed for the night, the windows dark, but Bumpy had a key. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The gym smelled of stale sweat, leather, and canvas. The shadows clung to the heavy bags hanging from the ceiling like slaughtered cattle. In a small office at the back, a single desk lamp illuminated the face of Harold, a former middleweight contender whose career had been ended by a mob, ordered crowbar to the knee in the 1930s. Harold now trained the neighborhood kids, keeping them off the corners. He was loyal to Bumpy, who quietly funded the gym's rent every month. "Bumpy?" Harold asked, squinting into the gloom as the gangster approached the office. "What are you doing here at 2 a.m, man? You need to hit a bag?" "No, Harold," Bumpy said, taking off his coat and draping it over a wooden chair. "I need you to teach me how to break a giant." For the next 6 hours, until the sun began to bleed a pale, freezing light over the skyline of Harlem, Bumpy and Harold remained on the canvas of the central ring. Bumpy did not want to learn how to box. He did not want to learn how to throw a devastating right hook. Boxing was a sport. What Bumpy was preparing for was surgical warfare. Harold stood in the center of the ring, playing the role of Vito Marcello. Over and over again, Harold would reach out with his right hand, his heavy fist aiming for the lapels of Bumpy's shirt. "When a man reaches for your collar with his right arm," Harold explained, his raspy voice echoing in the empty gym, he extends his arm, locking his elbow for leverage. He exposes the inside of his wrist, and he exposes his face, assuming your first instinct will be to pull away or grab his wrist to stop him. "I will not pull away," Bumpy said, his eyes tracking Harold's movements with lethal intensity. "Show me the counter." Harold demonstrated. As the right hand came forward, Harold showed Bumpy how to step inside the reach, closing the distance rather than retreating. He taught Bumpy the precise, devastating strike to the throat and the eyes with his left hand, not a punch, but a rigid, 2-finger thrust, designed to cause instant blinding pain and shock the attacker's nervous system. The moment you strike the eyes, his brain panics. His grip on your collar will instinctively tighten in a spasm, but his arm will remain locked, Harold instructed, breathing heavily. That is when you cross-grab his wrist with your right hand. You don't wrestle him. You pivot your hips, use his own forward momentum, and twist the joint outward against its natural hinge. With enough torque, you dictate exactly where his hand goes. They practice the motion hundreds of times. Reach, step inside, left strike to the eyes, pivot, right hand twists the wrist, drive the arm downward, over and over until the movement became fluid, instantaneous, and terrifyingly precise. Bumpy's muscles burned, his knuckles ached, but his face remained a mask of pure, unbroken concentration. He was memorizing the physics of the human body. He was ensuring that when Vito Marcello laid his hands on the king of Harlem, Vito's arm would be entirely under Bumpy's control. By Friday night, the preparation was complete. Bumpy retrieved the tiny, teardrop-shaped glass vial from Dr. Chen. He carefully nestled it securely within the folds of a custom-made silk handkerchief, folded perfectly in the breast pocket of his tailored suit. Saturday night descended on Harlem like a shimmering velvet curtain. The brutal cold of the winter street was instantly forgotten the moment one stepped through the heavy brass doors of the Cotton Club. The legendary venue was a sanctuary of heat, noise, and intoxicating glamour. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the aroma of roasting meats from the kitchen, and the hazy blue smoke of imported cigarettes. The bandstand was alive, a 10-piece jazz orchestra tearing through a frenetic, swinging tempo that vibrated in the floorboards and rattled the ice in the crystal bourbon glasses. The room was packed to capacity. The beautiful people of Harlem had come out in full force. Men in sharp, tailored suits and fedoras laughed loudly, while women draped in silk and faux fur sparkled under the dim, golden chandeliers. It was a scene of absolute, defiant joy, a kingdom reveling in its own sophisticated culture, completely separate from the oppressive gray world downtown. At the center of it all, sitting at the premier VIP table, positioned exactly where he had ordered Junie to place it, 3 feet closer to the bandstand, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He wore a dark blue suit of immaculate cut, a crisp white shirt, and a deep maroon tie. He looked every inch the regal, untouchable monarch of the neighborhood. Mamie sat beside him, looking breathtaking in a black evening gown, her posture perfect, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet vigilance of a queen who knows the castle is under threat. The table was surrounded by heavyweights. To Bumpy's right sat Reverend Clayton Powell, a titan of the community, his booming voice currently hushed as he leaned in to listen to Marcus Garvey Jr., who sat across the table, discussing the shifting political winds of the city. Hovering near the edge of the VIP section was Patricia Hamilton, a sharp, hungry journalist for a prominent black newspaper, her heavy flash camera resting on her hip, sensing that tonight was a night where history might be written. And standing directly behind Bumpy's chair, entirely still, his hands clasped in front of him, was Junie Bird. Junie was a coiled spring. He knew the trap was set. He knew the poison was in the pocket. But the tension of waiting for the Italian monster to arrive was agonizing. In the exact center of Bumpy's table sat an ornate silver candelabra. 3 thick white candles burned brightly, the flames dancing and flickering in rhythm with the jazz music, casting long, shifting shadows across Bumpy's calm, composed face. At precisely 10:30, the atmosphere in the Cotton Club subtly shifted. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a shout. It was a sudden, localized drop in temperature near the front entrance. The laughter near the cloakroom died away. The patrons standing near the bar parted, moving aside with an instinctive animal caution, recognizing a predator entering the watering hole. The heavy doors swung shut, and Vito Marcello stepped fully into the light. He looked massively out of place in the elegant club. He didn't belong amidst the silk and the jazz. He looked like a runaway freight train dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit. His neck was thick, his jaw was squared in a permanent scowl, and his dead, dark eyes scanned the room with utter contempt. He wasn't here to listen to music. He was here to follow Costello's orders. He was here to break a legend. Two smaller Italian mobsters flanked him, hovering near the door like nervous jackals, watching to make sure the spectacle went exactly as planned. Vito's eyes locked onto the VIP table. He saw the politicians. He saw the beautiful wife. He saw the journalist with the camera. And he saw Bumpy Johnson, sitting calmly, taking a slow, deliberate sip from a crystal glass of bourbon. A cruel, arrogant smile stretched across Vito's scarred face. He cracked his massive knuckles, the sound audible even over the blaring brass of the orchestra. He began to walk. He moved with heavy, thudding footsteps, ignoring the glares of the Harlem patrons, cutting a straight, aggressive path through the crowded dance floor. The musicians on the stage seemed to sense the approaching violence. The tempo of the music faltered slightly, the trumpet player lowering his horn an inch as he watched the giant approach the king's table. Mamie stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch Bumpy's arm. Reverend Powell stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes widening in alarm as he recognized the sheer, malicious intent radiating from the approaching man. Patricia Hamilton quietly raised her camera, her finger hovering over the flash button, her reporter's instinct screaming that the underworld was about to collide in a very public way. Junie Byard shifted his weight, his hand sliding smoothly toward his waistband, ready to draw steel and end the threat right here, consequences be damned. But Bumpy raised a single finger from his glass, a microscopic gesture, a silent command to Junie, hold. Bumpy did not stand up. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not look afraid. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the dancing flames of the candelabra in front of him, waiting for the exact moment the physics of the human body would dictate his victory. Vito Marcello reached the table. He towered over Bumpy, a mountain of muscle and hate. The air around the table seemed to freeze. Vito did not say a word. He simply sneered, raised his massive right hand, a cinder block of calloused flesh, and reached out across the table, his thick fingers opening wide, aiming directly for the collar of Bumpy Johnson's tailored silk shirt. The heavy hand breached the space between them, casting a long, dark shadow over the flickering candles. The entire Cotton Club held its breath. The fabric of Bumpy's lapel crumpled under the immense pressure of Vito's thick, calloused fingers. The physical weight of the Italian enforcer was staggering, radiating a suffocating heat that smelled of cheap garlic, stale sweat, and the heavy metallic tang of supreme, blinding arrogance. Vito leaned in, his lips curling back over yellowed teeth, preparing to spit the venomous, rehearsed words that Frank Costello had specifically written for him in that smoke-filled downtown social club. He intended to lift Bumpy entirely out of the chair, to suspend him in the air by his collar, and to display him like a hunted, broken trophy before the horrified, disbelieving eyes of Harlem's elite. In Vito Marcello's mind, the victory was already absolute. It was a foregone conclusion, written in the rigid theology of muscle and bone. He had spent his entire life bullying, breaking, and crushing men who were smaller than him, and in his violently limited worldview, everyone was smaller than him. He believed entirely, with the blind devotion of a zealot, in the religion of brute force. As his iron grip tightened relentlessly on the expensive silk of Bumpy's tailored collar, Vito's dark, empty, reptilian eyes danced with a cruel, sadistic anticipation. He was waiting for the flinch. He was waiting for the desperate, instinctive pull backward, the wide-eyed panic of a man suddenly realizing that his intellect meant absolutely nothing in the face of overwhelming physical destruction. Vito wanted to feel the terror radiating from the King of Harlem. He wanted to savor the precise microscopic moment Bumpy's legendary composure shattered, right before he hoisted him into the air and destroyed his myth forever in front of the flashing cameras and the silent jazz band. But the flinch never came. The human brain is fundamentally, biologically wired to retreat from sudden, overwhelming danger. It is an ancient evolutionary command hard-coded into our DNA. When a massive predator strikes, you create distance. You pull away to protect the vital organs. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a man who had spent years in the darkest, most brutal, and most isolated corners of the American penal system. He had spent his time in Alcatraz, not merely surviving, but systematically dismantling his own human frailties, rewiring his nervous system, and rebuilding his mind into an impenetrable iron fortress. He did not operate on biological instinct. He operated on cold, calculated geometry and the absolute certainty of his own preparation. As Vito's massive arm locked perfectly straight at the elbow, solidifying his vice-like grip and preparing to heave upward with the strength of a silverback gorilla, Bumpy moved. He did not pull backward. He did not raise his hands in a defensive posture. He did not struggle uselessly against the thick, sausage-like fingers crushing his lapel. Instead, defying every single law of natural self-preservation, Bumpy shifted his weight in the velvet chair and surged directly, violently forward, instantly closing the microscopic distance between himself and the giant. The speed of the movement was completely incongruous with the calm, relaxed, almost lazy posture Bumpy had maintained just a fraction of a second prior. It was the terrifying, invisible speed of a striking cobra, a motion so incredibly fast that it entirely bypassed the conscious visual processing of the terrified onlookers. Before Vito's slow, lumbering brain could even begin to register that his prey was moving toward him rather than desperately pulling away, Bumpy's left hand shot upward from his lap like a guided ballistic missile. Bumpy did not throw a punch. A closed fist punch against a man of Vito's sheer, terrifying density was a massive mathematical error, a complete waste of kinetic energy against thick facial bone and heavy shock-absorbing muscle. Instead, honoring the brutal, exhausting late-night lessons from Harold in that freezing, shadow-filled 8th Avenue boxing gym, Bumpy kept his left hand completely open. His index and middle fingers were locked tightly together, held as rigid and unbending as twin-forged steel dowels. With all the force of his forward momentum, he drove those two fingers directly, mercilessly, and with surgical precision into the soft, wet, entirely unprotected tissue of Vito Marcello's eyes. The biological impact was catastrophic. The human eye cannot be conditioned. It cannot be toughened by years of street fighting or hours lifting heavy iron weights in a downtown mafia social club. It remains entirely, universally vulnerable, the most exposed gateway directly to the brain. Vito did not roar. The air left his massive lungs in a high, thin, reedy gasp of absolute, unadulterated shock that sounded entirely alien coming from such a colossal frame. The human nervous system, when subjected to sudden, catastrophic trauma at its most vital sensory organ, instantly and violently overrides all previous conscious commands. The brain panics into full-blown survival mode, instantly abandoning whatever violent task it was performing, to address the blinding flash of white-hot, agonizing pain exploding directly behind the skull. Vito's vision instantly vanished into a terrifying starburst of crimson red and blinding, jagged white. His brain screamed, scrambling desperately to process the sudden, excruciating agony. In that microscopic moment of pure, blinding biological panic, his grip on Bumpy's collar convulsed, his thick fingers tightening in an involuntary, spasmodic reflex. But crucially, just exactly as Bumpy and Harold had predicted on the canvas mat of the gym, Vito's right arm remained rigidly locked. It was extended straight out over the exact center of the table, rendered utterly stiff and inflexible from the sudden massive tension of the nervous system shock. This was the window. This was the microscopic fraction of a second where the impenetrable, terrifying armor of the Italian giant cracked wide open, exposing the fragile mechanics underneath. Bumpy's right hand snapped upward and clamped down over Vito's thick, tree-trunk wrist like an industrial steel vise. Bumpy did not try to wrestle the massive arm down using his shoulder strength. He knew the giant still outweighed him by 100 pounds of raw, dense muscle. Fighting muscle with muscle was for street hustlers and fools who didn't understand the devastating application of physics. Instead, Bumpy dropped his center of gravity, sinking his weight deeply and securely into the foundation of his chair, and pivoted his hips with violent, snapping, devastating torque. He used Vito's own massive forward momentum, combined flawlessly with the locked rigidity of the enforcer's extended right arm, and twisted the wrist sharply outward. He rotated the thick, heavy joint violently against its natural anatomical hinge, pushing it past the absolute limit of its intended design. The sound that followed was sickening. It was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring of the club with horrifying clarity. It was the dull, heavy, wet popping of severely stressed cartilage and the tearing of thick, overextended tendons. The torque Bumpy applied was absolute, unforgiving, and executed with the emotionless precision of an executioner pulling a lever. Vito's massive knees buckled instantly under the excruciating, deeply unnatural pressure applied directly to his locked joints. His colossal frame twisted violently and awkwardly to the side, his body contorting in a desperate, animalistic attempt to alleviate the agonizing, tearing strain ripping through his arm and shoulder socket. But Bumpy maintained the wrist lock with mechanical, terrifying precision, pulling the trapped, rigid arm downward with an unstoppable gravitational force. Bumpy dictated exactly where the giant was going, and the giant had absolutely no say in the matter. He drove Vito's massive right hand directly, forcefully toward the center of the VIP table, directly toward the ornate, heavy silver candelabra, the heavy, meaty palm of Vito Marcello, the exact same ruthless, calloused hand that had shattered jaws, broken ribs, and terrorized indebted shopkeepers for the 5 Italian crime families, was forced violently downward onto the 3 burning, white-hot wicks. The flames did not flicker away. They licked hungrily and immediately at the thick, sweaty flesh, instantly superheating the skin and the delicate moisture on the surface of the palm. The reaction was immediate, horrifying, and profoundly sensory. The sharp, sickening, undeniable crackle of roasting meat cut through the thick air of the club, followed instantly by a dense, sweet, and deeply metallic scent of burning hair and searing human flesh. The acrid gray smoke billowed upward from the candelabra, mingling grotesquely with the expensive French perfumes, the sharp bay rum cologne, and the stale tobacco smoke that hung heavily in the glamorous atmosphere of the Cotton Club. The pain finally, inevitably pierced through the blinding, paralyzing shock of the initial eye strike, reaching Vito's vocal cords. A guttural, tearing, high-pitched scream ripped violently from the giant's throat. It was a sound of such pure, primal, unadulterated agony that it seemed to rattle the heavy crystal chandeliers hanging from the gilded ceiling. It was the sound of an apex predator suddenly and violently realizing it had stepped into a steel trap. The 10-piece jazz band on the stage abruptly ceased playing. It wasn't a coordinated professional stop. It was a chaotic, discordant, frightened crash of dropping brass and abruptly silenced drums as the seasoned musicians stared in absolute, unblinking horror at the VIP table. The vibrant, swinging, infectious heartbeat of the room flatlined in a single, terrifying second. The crowded, joyous dance floor surged backward as one living organism, a panicked, chaotic tidal wave of expensive silk dresses and tailored wool suits pressing desperately against the walls. The elite of Harlem gasped, their hands covering their mouths as they watched the invulnerable, terrifying downtown monster brought violently, humiliatingly to his knees by a man who hadn't even bothered to stand up from his velvet chair. At the periphery of the sudden chaos, the two smaller Italian mobsters, who had nervously escorted Vito into the club, finally snapped out of their paralyzed, wide-eyed disbelief. Seeing their invincible attack dog screaming, crying, and pinned helplessly to a table by a single man, a cold, sickening sweat of sheer panic washed over them. Their instructions were clear, but the reality unfolding before them was a nightmare. They reached frantically inside their heavy, tailored wool overcoats, their sweating fingers digging desperately for the cold steel of their concealed firearms, terrified of the consequences of returning downtown, having failed so spectacularly. But they were moving through thick molasses compared to the shadow standing directly behind Bumpy's chair. Before the mobsters' trembling fingers could even graze the checkered grips of their weapons, Junie Byard detached himself from the background. Junie did not run, he flowed. He moved with the terrifying, liquid grace of a stalking black panther, a man entirely at home in the sudden eruption of extreme violence. In the microscopic space of a single heartbeat, he crossed the 3 feet separating him from the closest, frantic Italian enforcer. The long, cold blue steel barrel of Junie's heavy .38 Special was suddenly pressed directly, painfully hard against the bridge of the mobster's nose. It was wedged right between his widened, terrified, bulging eyes, the metal biting into the skin. Junie didn't shout. He didn't make a grand, cinematic threat for the benefit of the watching, horrified crowd. He didn't need to project his voice to project his absolute lethality. He simply leaned in close, his face mere inches from the trembling Italian, his dark, dead eyes perfectly blank. They were empty, terrifying voids, radiating a silent promise of immediate, messy, and absolute destruction. "Breathe too hard," Junie whispered, his voice incredibly soft, yet it sliced through the chaotic, tearing screaming of the giant like a straight razor sliding through silk. "Breathe too hard, and I will paint this beautiful, expensive wallpaper with your thoughts. Keep your hands exactly where they are. Do not even let your fingers twitch. If you swallow wrong, you are a memory." The mobster froze instantly, completely paralyzed by the terrifying certainty in the enforcer's whisper. His hand remained suspended uselessly inside his coat, entirely neutralized by a man who treated extreme violence not as an act of passion, but as a practiced, refined, and deeply personal art form. The second mobster, seeing his partner a millimeter away from having his skull violently emptied onto the dance floor, slowly, agonizingly raised his empty, shaking hands into the air, his face completely drained of all color, looking like a ghost in a cheap suit. At the table, Bumpy Johnson ignored the peripheral threats entirely. He trusted Junie Bird implicitly. His focus remained absolutely, unwaveringly fixed on the screaming, thrashing, crying giant pinned helplessly beneath his iron grip. Vito was sobbing now. It was a pathetic, broken, wet, humiliating sound, his massive frame trembling violently, his expensive suit soaked in sweat as his flesh continued to literally roast over the open, dancing flames of the candles. His thick legs kicked uselessly against the heavy oak table, his polished shoes scuffing the wood, but Bumpy's grip on the twisted, ruined wrist was an absolute, inescapable lock. He was pinning the giant in his own private, agonizing hell, ensuring the flames did their precise, terrible work. With his left hand, his face remaining a perfect, unreadable mask of absolute calm, Bumpy calmly reached into the breast pocket of his impeccably tailored suit. His movements were entirely steady, smooth, and unhurried, betraying not a single ounce of adrenaline, fear, or physical exertion. He pinched the very edge of his custom-made folded silk handkerchief, pulling it free with a slow, deliberate, almost elegant theatrical motion. Concealed securely within the soft folds of the expensive silk fabric was the tiny, fragile, teardrop-shaped glass vial. It was the masterwork of Dr. Chen's subterranean, dimly lit laboratory, a weapon of invisible, terrifying chemistry. Holding the frantically struggling, screaming giant perfectly steady with his right hand, completely unbothered by the sheer physical effort required to keep the monster pinned, Bumpy used his left thumb to smoothly, quietly pop the delicate cork off the tiny glass vial. He held the vial directly over Vito's agonizingly burned, raw, smoking hand. He tilted the fragile glass. 3 clear, completely odorless drops of liquid detached from the lip of the vial. They fell slowly, catching the flickering golden light of the chandeliers as they descended through the thick, smoke-filled air. They landed precisely, flawlessly onto the violently blistered, split, seared flesh of the extreme burn on the giant's palm. The biological reaction was not delayed. It did not take minutes or hours to set in. It was horrifyingly, terrifyingly instantaneous. The exact millisecond the highly concentrated, incredibly rare neurotoxic compound seeped into the exposed, superheated, screaming nerve endings of Vito's palm, the entire nature of the enforcer's pain changed violently. The loud, tearing, high-pitched screaming abruptly, jarringly stopped. It was replaced instantly by a horrifying, wet, suffocating, breathless gurgle deep in the back of his massive throat. Vito's eyes, already bloodshot, swollen, and streaming tears from Bumpy's initial, devastating strike widened in pure, unadulterated, mind-shattering terror. The intense, burning agony of the fire was suddenly erased, swallowed completely whole by an entirely new, deeply unnatural, alien sensation that plunged his simple mind into absolute panic. The poison raced through the local nervous system of his arm with predatory, unstoppable speed. The violent, frantic, animalistic thrashing of Vito's massive arm ceased entirely. The thick, muscular forearm seized violently, trembling visibly under the skin as the chemical compound violently, mercilessly, and permanently severed the electrical communication between the giant's brain and his dense muscle tissue. Before the horrified, unblinking eyes of everyone in the Cotton Club, the physical destruction of Vito Marcello manifested in real time. His massive hand, the hand that had held the entire downtown underworld in a suffocating grip of fear, began to contract entirely on its own. The thick, sausage-like fingers curled inward, stiffening violently against his will, locking into a rigid, unnatural, horrifying claw. The color rapidly, sickeningly drained from the appendage, the healthy, flushed red of blood replaced entirely by a sickly, pale, dead, ashen gray. The muscles locked tight, freezing the heavy bones in place. The permanent paralysis Dr. Chen had promised was absolute, total, and irreversible. Vito's hand was no longer a terrifying weapon. It was a dead, useless, twisted piece of meat permanently anchored to his wrist. It looked like the talon of a dead bird. Only then, when the transformation was absolutely complete, did Bumpy finally release his vice-like grip. Without Bumpy's hand physically holding him up, Vito's thick legs gave out completely. He slumped backward, collapsing heavily, ungracefully onto the polished wooden floor of the Cotton Club, with a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the tables. The mountain of a man, the unstoppable mythological force of the Italian mafia, had been completely reduced in less than 60 seconds to a quivering, whimpering, broken child. He was completely dismantled, physically ruined, and psychologically shattered. Vito lay flat on his back, his massive chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths, staring in absolute mind-shattering horror at his hand. He tried desperately to open his fingers. He tried to flex his thick wrist. His brain screamed the commands, begging the muscles to move, but there was nothing. No response, no feeling, no movement, just a dead gray claw frozen in a permanent state of agonizing tension. He realized, with a wave of sickening, paralyzing dread that chilled his blood to ice, that he would never hold a weapon again. He would never strike a man again. He could not even hold a glass of water. His life as an enforcer, his entire identity, his value to the 5 families, had been permanently erased with 3 tiny drops of clear liquid. Bumpy Johnson did not look down at the man writhing on the floor. He calmly took the silk handkerchief meticulously, gently wiped a single microscopic drop of sweat from his brow, and folded the fabric neatly, tucking it back perfectly into the breast pocket of his suit. He reached forward and picked up his heavy crystal glass of bourbon. The amber liquid within was entirely unspilled. He had smoothly slid it an inch beyond the impact zone, a fraction of a second, before bringing the giant down, a silent, powerful testament to the absolute, terrifying control he possessed over his own body and his immediate environment. He took a slow, deeply appreciative sip, letting the expensive, aged liquor burn warmly down his throat, savoring the taste of absolute victory. Then, and only then, did he lower his chin to look down at the ruined, whimpering enforcer bleeding on his floor. The silence in the Cotton Club was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, thick quiet, broken only by the ragged, pathetic, wet whimpering of the broken giant on the floor. Every single eye in the massive room, from the terrified jazz musicians on the stage to the powerful politicians sitting at the table, was locked intensely onto Bumpy. They were waiting. They were holding their breath. They were waiting for the king to speak. "You men from downtown," Bumpy said. His voice was not loud. He did not need to shout to be heard. His smooth, resonating, deeply powerful baritone carried effortlessly through the dead silent room, commanding total, unquestioning, absolute authority. It was a voice that chilled the blood in the veins, entirely devoid of anger, entirely devoid of adrenaline or exertion. It was the cold, detached voice of a high court judge delivering an inescapable, permanent sentence. "You come up here," Bumpy continued, setting his crystal glass back down on the table with a soft, definitive clink. "You march up into our home, breathing your arrogance into our air. You operate under the foolish, childish delusion that because you have numbers, you possess true power. You believe that because you are loud, because you are crude, and because you are violent, you are strong. You believe that respect is something you can simply take by force, simply by gripping another man's collar in a crowded room. Bumpy leaned forward slightly in his velvet chair. The flickering, golden light from the candelabra cast long, sharp, dramatic shadows across his face, emphasizing the cold, unyielding, terrifying intelligence in his eyes. He stared directly down into Vito's terrified, tear-streaked, sweat-drenched face, forcing the broken giant to meet his gaze. He wanted Vito to see exactly who had destroyed him. "But strength," Bumpy whispered, the soft sound echoing loudly, menacingly in the quiet club, "is not about how tightly you can grip a piece of fabric. It is not about how hard you can punch a smaller man. True strength, real power, is knowing exactly how to break the hand that reaches for you, and doing it without ever losing your composure. Doing it without ever standing up." Bumpy sat back, smoothly adjusting the lapel of his suit. "You are going to get up off my floor. You are going to crawl back out into the snow, and you are going to go back downtown to Frank Costello. You are going to go back to Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese. You are going to stand in the center of their smoke-filled back rooms, and you are going to hold up that dead, useless piece of gray flesh hanging from your wrist for all of them to see." The absolute, terrifying certainty in Bumpy's voice made the two Italian goons standing near the door shiver violently in their heavy coats. "And when they ask you what happened," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a register that felt like solid ice water injected directly into the veins, "you will tell them that Ellsworth Johnson sends his personal regards. You will tell them that my table is not to be approached uninvited. Tell them that I do not play their ignorant games of physical intimidation. And tell them, very clearly, that the next time they decide to arrogantly reach their hands into Harlem, they will lose the whole arm." Flash. A sudden, brilliant, blinding burst of pure white light illuminated the entire scene, momentarily washing out the heavy shadows and freezing the dramatic moment in stark, undeniable, historical reality. Patricia Hamilton, the sharp, hungry, intensely observant journalist from the prominent black newspaper, had not succumbed to the paralyzing shock that gripped the rest of the room. She was a professional. She had recognized the terrifying, monumental magnitude of the history unfolding right in front of her. She had quietly stepped out from the periphery, raised her heavy, cumbersome flash camera to her eye, and captured the single image that would define the era. It was a photograph that would be printed on the front page of every paper uptown. It was a photograph that would be studied intensely in mob social clubs, passed around in police precincts, and whispered about in alleys across the entire country. It perfectly, flawlessly framed the massive, terrifying enforcer, the undisputed boogeyman of the Italian mafia, writhing pathetically on the floor, clutching a crippled gray claw-like hand to his massive chest. And towering above him, sitting comfortably in his chair, pristine, untouched, unbothered, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable, regal dominance, was the King of Harlem, his glass of bourbon reflecting the candlelight. It was the ultimate, undeniable visual destruction of the mafia's myth of physical supremacy. Bumpy did not acknowledge the camera. He did not blink at the flash. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. A sharp, echoing, final sound. Junie Byard understood the command instantly. He slowly, deliberately lowered his heavy revolver, taking the cold steel away from the sweating, terrified forehead of the Italian mobster, but his dark eyes never lost their lethal, promised intent. "Pick up your garbage," Junie commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in the chest. "Get him off this floor. Get him out of this club. Get him out of this neighborhood. If I see any of your faces north of 110th Street again, I won't use my hands to stop you. I'll use shovels to bury you." The two mobsters didn't need to be told twice. The paralyzing, suffocating spell of fear broke instantly, replaced entirely by the desperate, frantic, animalistic need to survive and escape the room. They rushed forward, grabbing Vito roughly by his uninjured arm and the collar of his cheap, sweat-soaked gray suit. The giant groaned in terrible, fresh agony as he was moved, completely unable to help them stand, his massive body entirely dead weight. They dragged him backward, hauling him desperately across the polished floor. His polished shoes scuffed loudly against the wood, leaving a trail of melted snow and sweat, pulling him rapidly toward the heavy, brass-studded doors of the entrance. They hauled the broken, whimpering enforcer out into the freezing, bitter winter night. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a loud, final thud, cutting off the howling cold wind and immediately sealing the warmth, the safety, and the culture back inside the sanctuary. The threat was gone. The message had been delivered with devastating, permanent, unforgettable clarity. The myth of the Italian untouchables had been broken over a silver candelabra. Bumpy Johnson sat in the deep silence for a long moment, letting the heavy reality of what had just occurred settle completely over the room. He reached out slowly and gently took Mamie's hand. Her skin was warm, her pulse completely steady. She looked at him, not with fear, not with shock, but with a deep, profound, knowing pride. She was the only person in the room who truly, deeply understood the immense depth of the intellect required to orchestrate such a flawless, bloodless, and devastatingly psychological victory. She gently squeezed his hand, a silent, loving affirmation of his absolute reign. Reverend Clayton Powell slowly, shakily exhaled a breath he realized he had been holding in his chest for the last 2 minutes. He reached nervously for a white cloth napkin to dab the heavy sweat from his forehead, looking at Bumpy with a complex mixture of absolute religious awe and deeply ingrained, fearful respect. Marcus Garvey, Jr. simply nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips, recognizing a brilliant, masterclass tactical maneuver that completely outshone any political speech he had ever heard or delivered. The street constantly whispered that the Italians were coming, that they had the numbers, that they had the muscle. But tonight, Bumpy Johnson had definitively proven that the street belonged to a mind that operated 10 steps ahead of the mob's crude, brute force. Bumpy turned his head slightly, his fedora casting a shadow over his eyes, looking toward the silent bandstand. The musicians were still completely frozen in place, holding their brass instruments awkwardly, terrified to make a sound, waiting for a clear sign from the king that the violence was truly, finally, over. Bumpy caught the eye of the band leader, a legendary, weathered trumpet player who had seen his fair share of rough, bloody nights in the city over the decades. Bumpy raised his crystal glass of bourbon in a slow, respectful, silent toast and offered a subtle, reassuring nod of his head. "The night is still young, gentlemen," Bumpy called out softly, his voice warm again. "Let the music play." The band leader swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He nodded back quickly, raised his gleaming trumpet to his lips, and closed his eyes. He counted the beat with a tap of his foot, and the drummer tentatively, softly tapped the snare. Within seconds, the 10-piece jazz orchestra roared back to vibrant life, launching into a fast, swinging, triumphant, incredibly loud melody that instantly washed over the massive room. The blaring brass and rhythmic drums chased away the lingering, metallic smell of burnt flesh, pushing it into the vents and replacing the suffocating, terrifying tension with the intoxicating, defiant, unstoppable rhythm of Harlem. The crowd slowly, collectively, began to breathe again. The dancers cautiously, nervously returned to the polished wooden floor, their movements stiff and jerky at first, but quickly relaxing as the powerful music took hold of their bodies. The laughter returned, a little more nervous, a little more awe-struck, and slightly pitched higher than before. But it was alive. The intricate ecosystem of the Cotton Club healed itself rapidly, returning to its vibrant, untouchable glory, but the fundamental atmosphere of the room had permanently shifted. Everyone in that room, from the waiters to the politicians, knew they had just witnessed a masterpiece of underworld warfare. They had witnessed the king defend his crown without ever rising from his throne. Downtown, in the heavily guarded, smoke-filled back room of the mahogany-paneled social club, Frank Costello, Carlo Gambino, and Vito Genovese were sitting comfortably, drinking expensive wine, waiting for the phone to ring with news of their great victory. They had no idea they were about to receive a package they never expected. They were about to learn, in the most horrific way possible, that sending a heavy sledgehammer to violently crack a complex safe was a fool's errand when the man sitting inside the safe possessed the exact key to the human nervous system. They thought they were playing a simple game of checkers with a street thug who got lucky. They had just realized, entirely too late, that they were playing a high-stakes game of chess against a relentless, brilliant grandmaster who was perfectly willing to permanently burn the board to ashes to protect his crown. Bumpy Johnson leaned back deeply into his velvet chair, the undisputed, unchallenged king of his domain. He sat there listening to the complex jazz, feeling the steady warmth of his wife's hand in his, and watching the blurry city lights glitter defiantly outside the frosted snow-covered windows. The winter of 1956 was brutally, unforgivingly cold, freezing the blood of lesser men, but inside the borders of his kingdom, the fire of his legacy burned brighter, hotter, and more dangerously than it ever had before.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.